I was interrupted 15 times during the reading of my husband's will. They didn't let me say a single word. But that silence became the beginning of their downfall. The funeral was quiet, though not in the way my husband would have wanted. He used to say a funeral should be messy. People weeping openly, telling stories too long, dropping tissues on the floor, hugging until shoulders were wet with tears. Instead, it was hushed and efficient. The church smelled faintly of lilies and polished wood, and every seat was neatly filled with neighbors, friends, and the kind of distant relatives who come only for the ritual of it. I sat in the front pew, my black gloves folded in my lap, trying to keep my hands from shaking. My husband, my Robert, was gone. My partner of more than 40 years, the man who built a life with me brick by brick, had been lowered into the earth. I thought the hardest part would be the silence that would follow me home. But I was wrong. Even as the last hymn ended, I noticed my children, my son and my daughter, leaning together, their heads bent in whispers. Not words of comfort, not prayers, but plans. Their eyes did not linger on their father's casket, nor on me. They were already restless, impatient. At the house afterward, when neighbors drifted in with casseroles and condolences, my children barely stayed in the room long enough to greet them. They hovered near the dining table, flipping through papers they had already pulled from a briefcase. I stood at the kitchen sink, rinsing a half-empty coffee cup, and listened as my daughter's voice cut sharp through the low murmur of mourning. The estate alone is worth over $1 million. If we move quickly, we can. I dropped the cup back into the basin before I could hear the rest. My breath caught in my throat. Was this what my Robert's death had become to them? A ledger? A chance to carve the bones of his life's work into neat little parcels? The will reading came only 2 days later, faster than I had expected. I thought there would be time for grief to breathe, but no, my children pressed for it. They wanted it settled, sorted, divided. We sat in the lawyer's office, the air smelling of eucalyptus and printer ink. I wore the same coat I had worn to the funeral, the black wool still carrying the faint scent of my husband's aftershave. The lawyer began, his voice calm and steady, reading Robert's words aloud. Every line felt like a piece of him still speaking to me. But every time I tried to open my mouth to add something, perhaps a memory, perhaps a correction, I was silenced. The first time, my son lifted a hand sharply and said, "Mother, please. Let's not drag this out." The second time, my daughter leaned forward, her nails clicking against the table, saying, "We've already discussed this, haven't we?" And it went on like that. 15 times in total. 15 times I tried to speak, and 15 times my own children cut me down before a single sentence could leave my lips. By the 7th interruption, my throat ached with unshed words. By the 10th, I stopped meeting their eyes. By the 15th, I sat in silence, my hands folded in my lap, staring at the folder of papers that spelled out the life my husband and I had built together. I wanted to shout, "Do you not see me? Do you not remember the years we worked side by side, your father and I, so you could have the lives you do?" But grief weighed me down heavier than anger. The lawyer hesitated once, glancing at me with a flicker of unease. He knew I had not been allowed a word. But he continued, dutifully reading Robert's will, line after line of instructions, of love disguised as order. Robert had been clear. He had thought of everything. What would go to whom, how the estate was to be handled, how the company was to remain intact. He had written it all, his steady hand guiding us even after death. Yet my children did not hear it that way. They leaned in close to one another, whispering, their pens scratching, their eyes already stripping away the words in search of loopholes. When the reading ended, I opened my mouth once more. Just once more. "Robert, your father," I began. But my daughter's voice sliced over mine, sharp as glass. "Mother, please. We don't have time for this." And there it was. My silence sealed like a wound. I sat back, my lips pressed together so tightly they trembled. I looked at the hands that had once held Robert's across every storm of our life, now empty in my lap. I thought of how quickly love, or at least the pretense of it, had turned to greed. That night, when I returned to my empty home, I left the lights off. I sat in the kitchen with only the moonlight spilling across the floor. The room smelled of Robert still. His books, his aftershave, the faint smoke of his old pipe. But around it all was a new cold air. The kind that comes when trust has been broken. I whispered into that silence, though no one could hear me. They would not even let me speak. 15 times. 15 times my voice was nothing to them. The tears came then, hot and bitter. But beneath the grief something else stirred. Something small, quiet, but unyielding. The first glimmer of disbelief hardening into resolve. For though my children thought they had silenced me, I was not done speaking. I had thought, foolishly perhaps, that after the funeral and the reading of the will, there might be a pause, a moment of decency, of respect for the man we had just buried. But the very next morning I discovered how wrong I was. I woke early, as I always did when Robert was alive. The habit of decades doesn't break just because your heart has. The house was still quiet, carrying the echo of his absence. I set the kettle on, made tea, and sat at the kitchen table with his chair still across from mine. For a moment, I almost turned to ask him how we were going to handle the children's behavior. But of course the chair stayed empty. By noon, both my son and daughter were in the house again, their coats tossed carelessly on the sofa, their voices filling the air with plans that made my stomach turn. They didn't even lower their tones, not anymore. Grief had no place in them, only calculation. "The estate's worth $1 million, maybe more," my son said, pacing the living room with that impatient stride of his. "If we sell quickly, there's already interest from developers. They want the land for a factory. It's a clean sale, no waiting around." I set my teacup down too hard, the porcelain rattling against the saucer. "A factory?" I asked softly. "This is your father's land. The house where you were born. Where he planted every tree with his own hands. You'd sell it off for smokestacks and concrete?" He waved his hand as though brushing me away. "Mother, you're not listening. It's not about nostalgia. It's about opportunity. This is the smart move." Before I could answer, my daughter chimed in, her tone brisk, professional, as though she were presenting at a business meeting. "And the company will sell that too. Competitors are already offering. We could get cash in hand within weeks." I stared at her, my breath catching in my chest. "The company? The one your father and I built from nothing? The one we spent our lives keeping alive through lean years, through sleepless nights, through every sacrifice we could make?" She sighed, exasperated. "Yes, Mother. That company. You and Father may have enjoyed playing shopkeepers, but it's time to be realistic. We can't run it. We don't want to. Better to sell now while it still holds value." Her words struck me harder than any physical blow. I looked at their faces, so familiar yet suddenly foreign. My own children, speaking of their father's life work as though it were nothing more than a broken chair to be hauled off. Do they not remember? I thought. Do they not remember the nights Robert and I sat at the kitchen table, bills spread out before us, praying the bank would give us just one more month to make the payments? Do they not remember the long evenings when he came home bone-tired from the shop, and I would sit with him, ledger in hand, until midnight, planning how to keep it afloat? That company was not just a business. It was our life story written in ink and sweat. We began with nothing but a loan and a dream. I worked beside him, balancing books, answering phones, scrubbing floors when we couldn't afford help. We missed vacations, put off buying new clothes, scraped by so the business could grow. Robert used to say, "One day our children will inherit something solid, something they can be proud of." And now here they were, talking of selling it to strangers who meant to dismantle it piece by piece. Not to carry it forward, not to honor their father's labor, but to line their own pockets as quickly as possible. You would sell your father's name for a handful of cash, I whispered. My son looked at me sharply. Don't be dramatic. We're thinking ahead. It's what he would have wanted, security for us. No, I said, shaking my head. My voice trembled, but I forced the words out. That is not what he wanted. He wanted legacy. He wanted memory. He wanted you to understand the worth of something built with your own two hands. They exchanged a glance then, one of those quick, silent looks children share when they believe their parent no longer understands the world. My daughter pulled a stack of papers from her bag, spreading them across the table. Mother, let's be honest. You can't manage any of this on your own. We'll handle it. Just sign where we need you to, and we'll take care of everything. I looked down at those papers but didn't touch them. The black letters swam before my eyes. Legal words, binding words. Words meant to erase everything Robert and I had built. My throat closed around a sob, but I swallowed it back. They would not see me break. Instead, I rose quietly, gathering the teacup and saucer into my hands. I think you both should leave now, I said. My son laughed, short and bitter. Mother, this isn't your decision anymore. But it was, though they didn't know it. Robert's will had made it so, written in clear, careful strokes. They thought they could twist it, push me aside, erase my voice. But I had heard every word, and I knew my husband's wishes better than anyone alive. Still, I let them talk. I let them draw their plans in the air, schemes of quick sales and easy money. My heart cracked wider with every word, not just from the betrayal of property, but from the deeper betrayal of memory, of family, of the man we had just laid in the ground. When they finally left, slamming the door behind them, I stood alone in the kitchen, hands trembling as I washed the empty teacup. My reflection in the window looked pale, older somehow, but there was something in my eyes they had not noticed. Grief, yes, but also fire. For if they thought they could sell away Robert's legacy without a fight, they had forgotten who their mother was. It didn't take long for the cracks to show. Greed alone I could almost have understood. Selfishness disguised as ambition, children eager for money they hadn't earned. But what I came to see in the weeks that followed was darker than greed. It was desperation, the kind that eats at a person until they are willing to devour anything in their path, even their own mother. Started with a phone call. I was sitting in Robert's old chair in the study, the ledger still open on the desk where he had last left it. The phone rang, sharp and unwelcome in the silence. On the other end was a man I did not know, his voice brisk, his tone bordering on rude. "Is your son available?" he asked. I told him no, he did not live here. The man hesitated, then pressed, "Tell him Mr. Callahan expects payment this week. He knows the amount. No more delays." The line clicked dead before I could respond. I sat very still, the receiver warm in my hand. Payment. No more delays. My son had debts. Large ones by the sound of it. The next clue came not long after, when I visited my daughter at her house. I thought perhaps I could appeal to her, reason with her woman to woman. But when I arrived, she was pacing the kitchen, her phone pressed hard to her ear, her voice a hiss of frustration. "I told you I'll have the money soon. Just stop calling me at work. Do you want me to lose my job?" When she noticed me in the doorway, she froze. For a split second, her eyes flashed with something sharp, fear perhaps or guilt, before she pasted on a brittle smile. "Mother, what a surprise. I was just finishing a call." But I had already heard enough. Piece by piece, the truth came together. My son's debts were tied to gambling, poker tables and horse races where he'd lost far more than he could afford. My daughters were different, bad business deals, investments in ventures that had collapsed before they even began, loans taken in secret with interest rates that grew like weeds. They weren't talking about selling the estate and the company simply for wealth. They needed the money. They were drowning, and instead of swimming, they meant to cling to anything nearby, even if it pulled me under with them. The betrayal cut deeper now. It wasn't just their indifference to their father's memory, or their eagerness to cash in on his death. It was the cold knowledge that they would sacrifice anyone, anything, to dig themselves out of the holes they had dug. One evening, after they had both stormed through the house in another argument over who would get what, I sat in the quiet kitchen with a cup of tea cooling in my hands. My fingers traced the rim of the cup, round and round, as my mind replayed every word. I thought back to the nights Robert and I had stayed up late, worrying over bills, but never once did we consider betraying those we loved to pay them. We endured, we tightened our belts, we worked harder. Love had been our anchor through every storm. And now I looked at my children and saw nothing of that same anchor in them. Instead, I saw people unraveling, reckless, frantic, clawing at the world as if it owed them. I wanted to cry for them, to hold them as I did when they were small, when scraped knees and bad dreams were the worst of their troubles. But they were no longer children. They were grown and they had chosen their paths. And what frightened me most was that their desperation had made them cruel. I remembered my son's voice at the lawyer's table, sharp with impatience. "Mother, please. Don't drag this out." I remembered my daughter's dismissive tone. "You can't manage this on your own. Just sign where we need you to." It wasn't just greed. It was survival. And in survival, they had forgotten compassion. That night, I sat at Robert's desk and opened one of his old journals. He had filled its pages with notes, ideas, reminders, and occasionally, when he thought no one would read them, his worries. One line leapt out at me, written in his steady hand years ago. "If the children ever forget the value of honesty, it will not be money they lose. It will be themselves." I closed the book with trembling fingers. He had seen it even then. The warning I had ignored in my hope that love would always be enough. I leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, and let the truth settle heavy in my chest. My children were not merely greedy. They were desperate. And desperation, I knew, could lead them to do things far worse than selling land and company. Desperation made people dangerous. But I also knew this. Robert had trusted me to protect what we had built. His will, his words, his memory, they were all the shield I needed. So I would not break. Not for them. Not for their debts, their mistakes, their betrayal. I sipped my cold tea, set the cup down, and whispered into the quiet room, as though Robert were still listening. "They think I am weak. They think I will fold. But I will not let them destroy us. Not you, not what we built, not even me." And in that whisper, I felt the first real seed of resolve take root. After the truth of their debt settled into me, I made a choice. Not one I spoke aloud, not even to myself at first. I chose silence. Not the heavy, broken silence they had forced upon me at the will reading, but a different kind. A weapon sharp and patient. When my son and daughter returned to the house, their voices sharp with urgency, I folded myself small in my chair and nodded as though I agreed. I poured tea, set out plates, listened to their endless plans to sell, to dismantle, to cash out. I let them think they were winning. But my eyes were open. I noticed how my son's hand shook slightly when he thought no one was looking. How he checked his watch again and again, muttering about meetings. I remembered the name Callahan from that phone call, and tucked it away like a pebble in my pocket. I noticed how my daughter flinched whenever her phone buzzed. How she slipped away to answer it in whispers, always returning with a brittle smile that didn't reach her eyes. I saw the way they avoided each other's gaze when speaking of money, as though even between them there were secrets too sour to be shared. And I remembered. Dates, numbers, names. A lifetime of keeping accounts, balancing ledgers, organizing files. All those skills that had once built a business were now my quiet armor. That evening, when they had gone, I walked into the kitchen and filled the kettle. The house was too still, too large without Robert's voice in it. But the ritual steadied me. Boil the water, steep the leaves, pour into the good china cup Robert had given me one Christmas long ago. I carried the tea to the table and sat, staring at the steam rising. My reflection wavered in the surface of the liquid, pale and lined, but my eyes were steady. I thought about the years Robert and I had built this life. We had fought our battles side by side, never turning against one another, never once seeing each other as the enemy. Now, with him gone, it was our own children who came against me. The betrayal was a wound, yes, but wounds can harden into resolve if you let them. I sipped my tea slowly, the warmth spreading through me. In the silence of that kitchen, I decided, they will not succeed. The next day I continued my act. I let them believe I was confused, overwhelmed, too soft to resist. When my son shoved papers across the table, I nodded as though considering them. When my daughter spoke of next steps, I kept my voice mild, my face placid. Inside, though, I was listening, watching, collecting. I began keeping a small notebook, tucked away in the drawer of my bedside table. Each night I wrote down what I had seen, what I had overheard, the names that had slipped from their lips when they thought I wasn't paying attention, dates of phone calls, times they came and went. Every detail, however small, I recorded. It reminded me of the early years of the business, when Robert would handle the shop floor and I would keep the books. "You're the real soldier," he used to tell me, marching line by line through the numbers. Now I felt like that soldier again, only this time the battlefield was my own family. One evening, after a particularly heated argument between the two of them about who would get the larger share of the company sale, I walked into the kitchen alone. The air still vibrated with their anger. I poured myself a cup of tea and sat in the quiet, letting their words replay in my head. "Do you want me to end up in jail?" my son had snapped. "Don't you dare pin this on me," my daughter had hissed back. Debt. Desperation. Lies. I cradled the cup in my hands and stared at the wallpaper Robert had chosen decades ago. Little faded flowers now, curling at the edges but still there. Still holding on. I reached out and touched the wall, and for a moment I felt his presence, as though he too were listening, as though he too knew what I had to do. My grief was still there, sharp as broken glass. But alongside it now was something stronger. A quiet determination that grew with each breath. I would not let them undo what we built. From that night on, my silence was no longer weakness. It was a mask. I smiled when they boasted, nodded when they schemed, poured tea when they grew impatient. And all the while, I kept my soldier's notebook filling with truths they thought were hidden. The kettle hissed again, and I poured another cup, the steam curling upward. I whispered into the quiet, "You always told me, Robert, to let the children learn from their mistakes. But this isn't a mistake. This is destruction. And I will not let them destroy us." And with that, I drank the tea steady and calm. The fight had not yet begun, but I knew then I would be ready. It was late one afternoon when I finally stepped into Robert's study again. I had been avoiding it since the funeral. The door stayed shut, the key left hanging on its hook, as though opening it might unleash a flood of grief too heavy to bear. That little room was his sanctuary. Dark wood shelves lined with books, the old oak desk he polished by hand, the faint smell of pipe tobacco still lingering in the air. But silence alone would not protect what we had built. I knew that now. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, closing it softly behind me. Dust had settled in the corners, but the room was much as he left it. Papers stacked in neat piles, his leather chair tucked under the desk, his spectacles resting on top of a ledger. I reached out and touched them, the weight of absence pressing heavy in my chest. For a moment I almost faltered, almost turned back. But then I remembered my children's voices, sharp and cold, talking of sales and profits, of factories and quick money. I remembered how they had dismissed me, silenced me, trampled over Robert's wishes as though they were nothing more than scraps of paper. And I knew I could not falter. I began at the desk. Drawer by drawer, I pulled out files and folders, stacking them carefully on the floor. Contracts, letters, receipts, tax records. Robert had kept everything. He had always been meticulous, believing that every piece of paper told a part of the story. As I sifted through them, I felt the years peel back. There were contracts signed with old friends, notes of encouragement Robert had written to himself in the margins of invoices, letters he never sent. I paused over one in particular, written in his bold, steady hand, addressed to me. If you are reading this without me, remember. Don't let them undo what we built. I closed my eyes, clutching it to my chest. His words were a lifeline, steadying me in the storm. But the real shock came later, buried deep in a folder marked simply company correspondence. Inside were letters from the very competitor my children had spoken of, the one they planned to sell to for quick cash. I read them slowly, my eyes widening with each line. It was no offer of partnership, no promise of preservation. Their intention was clear: to dismantle the company, strip it of assets, and erase the name Robert and I had spent our lives building. They had written it plainly, even smugly, certain that by the time anyone realized, it would be too late. My hands trembled as I set the letter down. My children hadn't even bothered to read the fine print. They were too blinded by their desperation, too eager to grasp at money, to see the trap waiting for them. I spread the papers across the desk, arranging them in careful order. Every letter, every contract, every detail that proved what was really happening. I opened my notebook, the same one where I had been keeping records of my children's lies and debts, and began copying everything down. Dates, names, intentions, proof. Page after page filled beneath my hand, neat as a ledger. It felt almost like soldier's work, as though I were preparing ammunition for a battle not yet fought. As the hours passed, the light faded from the windows, and the house grew quiet. I turned on the lamp and kept working. The tick of the clock on the wall marked each moment, but I did not tire. There was something steadying, almost holy, in the work. At one point, I found myself whispering aloud, "I see you, Robert. I see what you left for me, and I promise I will use it." By midnight, I had filled the notebook with evidence. Letters, notes, contradictions, all neatly organized. I tucked it into the drawer of the desk, locking it carefully. Only then did I rise, stretching my stiff back, and walk to the window. The garden lay quiet under the moonlight, the flowers Robert planted still blooming stubbornly, even in grief. I pressed my palm against the glass, feeling the coolness steady me. They thought me powerless. They thought I would sign whatever papers they thrust before me, too broken to resist. But I had something stronger than their greed. I had truth. And truth, written in Robert's own hand, was more powerful than all their lies. I turned back to the desk, one last glance at the stacks of papers now neatly ordered. This was no longer just about grief. This was a battle for memory, for legacy, for the life we had poured ourselves into. And I would not lose it. That night, before I left the study, I whispered into the stillness, "Rest easy, Robert. I am gathering the weapons. They won't know what hit them." I closed the door, carrying my notebook upstairs, and slipped it under my pillow as though it were a shield. For the first time since his passing, I slept without tears. The days that followed were quieter than I expected. My son and daughter still called, still pressed for signatures and meetings, but I kept my answers vague, soft, the way a woman plays small when she's thought to be fragile. "I'll think on it," I'd say. "Let me sleep on it." They mistook delay for weakness, and I let them. But behind those pauses, something inside me was shifting. Grief has a way of settling in layers. At first it is raw, sharp as glass, cutting every time you breathe. Then it sinks deeper, quieter, not gone but heavy, like a stone you carry in your chest. I still felt that stone every hour of every day. But around it, something else had begun to grow. Resolve. It happened in little moments. One morning I wandered into the living room and caught sight of Robert's chair by the fireplace. He had always claimed it, his throne, as he liked to joke. The leather was worn soft where his elbows had rested, the seat molded to his frame. I lowered myself into it and closed my eyes. For a moment I could almost hear the rustle of his newspaper, the soft clearing of his throat before he read a line aloud to me. I laid my hand on the armrest and whispered, "I hope you're proud of me." Another evening, I went to the closet to fetch a sweater and was overcome by the faint, lingering scent of his aftershave. Aquavelva, the same brand he'd used since our first years together. I pressed the sleeve of his old jacket to my face and breathed in. It was like being wrapped in him just for a moment. My chest ached, but in that ache there was also strength. And then there was the kitchen, always the kitchen. Cooking had been our shared language. He would chop onions too big, I would scold, and he would laugh and toss one in my direction like a mischievous boy. Now, I found myself setting two places at the table out of habit. I'd cook a meal too large for one. A roast chicken, mashed potatoes, his favorite green beans with garlic. When I sat alone, I would glance at his empty chair. And though tears pricked my eyes, I could almost hear him say, "Don't let them undo what we built." Those words became my anchor. One night, unable to sleep, I rose and padded down the hallway to the study. I unlocked the desk drawer and pulled out my notebook, the one filling quickly with evidence, details, truths my children thought hidden. I spread it across the desk and traced the lines with my finger. Each word was steady, each note a piece of armor. But what truly steadied me was not the ink. It was Robert's presence. I could feel him in that room, in the papers he left, in the order of his files, in the careful way he had prepared for this moment without ever telling me. It was as though he had known somehow that I would need guidance. I sat in his chair, the leather creaking beneath me, and spoke softly into the stillness. "You always told me I was stronger than I thought. Well, Robert, I'm starting to believe you. I see now this isn't just grief, it's a battle. And I won't lose." The clock ticked steadily on the wall, and for once the sound didn't feel empty. It felt like a heartbeat keeping time with mine. The loneliness of widowhood was still there, of course. Every corner of the house reminded me of him. The dent in the pillow where his head used to rest, the chipped mug he always used for coffee, the garden he tended with such pride. Each reminder was a knife, yes, but also a spark. For in each of those memories lived his strength. And so, little by little, my sorrow began to turn into something else. Not anger, that would have been easy. Not revenge, that would have been bitter. No, what grew in me was something steadier, resolve. The kind of strength that comes from knowing you are standing not just for yourself, but for someone you loved, for everything you built together. I pressed the notebook shut, laid my hand on its cover and whispered, "I will fight. For you. For us. For what we made with our hands and our hearts." That night, for the first time, I dreamed of Robert not as the frail man in a hospital bed, but as he had been in his prime, broad-shouldered, steady, his eyes alight with determination. In the dream he didn't speak. He only stood beside me, his hand resting on my shoulder, and I felt safe. When I woke, the morning sun was pouring through the window, bright and golden. I rose with a steadiness I hadn't felt since before the funeral. The children still thought me silent, powerless, old. Let them think so. They had mistaken my grief for defeat, my quiet for surrender. They had forgotten that silence can be the sharpest blade of all. And now, with Robert's memory steadying me, I was ready to use it. I knew there would come a time when my notebook, my papers, and my quiet observations would no longer be enough. A storm was brewing, and when it broke, I would need more than memory and determination. I would need the law. But I also knew I had to tread carefully. My children were desperate and reckless, and desperate people are dangerous. If they suspected I was preparing to stop them, they'd only grow bolder. They thought me fragile, incapable, half blind to the details of what they were doing. Let them keep thinking it. One morning, after a long night of reading through Robert's letters again, I dressed in my best coat and sensible shoes. I took my notebook, tucked it into my handbag, and walked to the office of a man Robert and I had trusted years ago. Mr. Harris, a lawyer we had worked with when the business was still young. He was older now, with silver hair and a face weathered by years of courtroom battles, but when he saw me at his door, his eyes softened. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, standing to greet me. "I am so sorry for your loss." "Thank you," I whispered, my voice catching despite myself. Then I steadied, tightening my grip on the handbag. "But I didn't come for condolences, Mr. Harris. I came for help." We sat across from each other at his oak desk, the afternoon light falling across neat stacks of case files. I opened my notebook and began to lay out what I had gathered. Dates, names, debts, overheard arguments. Letters from competitors tucked into Robert's files. Contracts with hidden intentions scrawled plainly in the margins. Mr. Harris leaned forward, his brows knitting as he read. "They plan to sell to people who will gut the company?" "Yes," I said, my voice firm. "They want cash, nothing more. They'd let Robert's legacy burn if it meant saving themselves." He turned a page slowly, tapping his pen against the margin. "And you're certain they've tried to push you into signing without proper explanation? 15 times at the will reading they cut me off. Since then they've shoved papers at me, rushed me, dismissed me when I ask questions. They want me silent, pliant. They think grief has made me weak." A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, though it was more grim than kind. "They underestimate you." I sat a little taller. "Yes, they do." For the next hour we pieced it together. Mr. Harris explained which documents mattered most, which would stand up in court, which might expose my children's dealings with creditors and gambling tables and failed investments. He asked questions precise and careful, and I answered as best I could. The truth of it became clearer with every word. This was no longer a family quarrel. It was a legal battle waiting to happen. When I finally leaned back, weary but steadier, Mr. Harris folded his hands. "Mrs. Whitaker, you have something very strong here. Stronger than they know. But you must be patient. Let them keep digging their own hole while we prepare. When the time comes, we'll strike." Patience. I had already been practicing that in silence, in the kitchen with my tea, in the study with Robert's papers. Now it became strategy. As I left his office, the autumn wind caught at my coat, but instead of shivering, I felt warmed from within. I was no longer simply a grieving widow. I was the guardian of my husband's legacy, armed with truth and counsel. That evening, when my son and daughter arrived again, their voices sharp and full of plans, I played my part. I nodded, feigned confusion, even apologized for not understanding some of the documents they waved in my face. Inside, though, I was calm. My notebook was no longer just mine. It was evidence, a net slowly tightening around them. I began to notice more now that I knew what to look for. A forged signature on one document they left behind, sloppy in its haste. A bank statement tucked mistakenly into my daughter's folder, revealing a loan she had hidden. A rushed email my son forgot to close out on his phone, full of promises to creditors he could never keep. Each piece I tucked into my memory, and when I was alone I wrote it down. The web was spinning itself strand by strand. At night I sat at the kitchen table with the lamp burning low, my notebook open before me. The house was quiet but for the hum of the refrigerator and the tick of the old clock. I thought of Robert, of his steady hands guiding mine as we built everything we had. And I thought of my children, tangled in lies of their own making. "They think I am beaten," I whispered into the stillness. "But I am one step ahead." The words steadied me like armor settling into place. For once I didn't cry. I didn't crumble. I closed the notebook, slid it neatly beside me, and poured myself another cup of tea. The steam rose in the lamplight, curling soft and steady. The storm was coming, yes. But I would be ready. The day of the trial dawned gray, with the drizzle tapping against the windows like a warning. I rose early, dressed carefully in my navy suit, the one Robert always said made me look dignified, and pinned his silver brooch at my collar. I carried my notebook in my handbag, though by now the lawyer had copies of everything. Still, I wanted it with me. It felt like armor or perhaps a talisman. When I entered the courthouse, my children were already there. They stood together, whispering, their faces tight with impatience. My son wore a sharp suit that couldn't quite hide the bags beneath his eyes. My daughter's smile was brittle, forced, as she nodded to acquaintances in the hall. They looked confident, smug even, as though the outcome was already theirs. They did not look at me. Not once. Inside the courtroom, the air was cool and smelled faintly of polished wood and paper. The judge entered, robes sweeping, and everyone rose. I folded my hands in my lap, steady though my heart beat fast. At first, my children's lawyer spoke boldly. He painted me as an old woman too burdened by grief to understand business matters, insisting that my son and daughter were only acting in the family's best interest. He used words like efficiency and progress, as though they could wash away the reality of greed. But then it was Mr. Harris's turn. He rose slowly, his voice calm but firm. He began with the will. Robert's words, Robert's instructions. Each clause was read clearly, each point repeated so there could be no confusion. And then he began to lay out what I had gathered. The forged signatures. The hidden debts. The correspondence with competitors who intended to dismantle the company. Each piece of paper, each date, each word copied carefully from my notebook was presented like a brick in a wall. With every brick, the case against my children grew stronger. At first they sat stiff, their jaws tight. But as the evidence piled up, their composure cracked. My son leaned forward, whispering furiously to his lawyer. My daughter fidgeted, tapping her nails against the table. When the letters from the competitor were read aloud, my daughter's face flushed deep red. "That's not true," she burst out, rising from her seat. "We didn't know they meant to." Her brother snapped his head toward her. "Don't speak," he hissed. But it was too late. The judge had heard, and the courtroom had stirred with murmurs. More evidence followed, bank statements, loan records, careless mistakes they had left in their haste. Their secrets, hidden in shadows, now lay bare in the light of the courtroom. By the time Mr. Harris revealed the gambling debts, my son's face was pale, his hands clenched into fists on the table. "You dragged us here," he shouted suddenly, turning on his sister. "If it weren't for your stupid investments." She whirled on him, eyes blazing. "My investments? You lost half a fortune on horse races. Don't you dare blame this on me." They shouted back and forth, their voices rising, forgetting where they were. The courtroom gasped, people leaning forward in disbelief as the two of them, once united against me, tore into each other. The judge's gavel cracked against the wood. "Order! Sit down, both of you." But the damage was done. Their alliance, built on greed and desperation, had splintered in full view of everyone. They were no longer a united front, but two drowning souls clawing at each other for air. I sat silently watching. I did not smile, though a quiet satisfaction settled in me. They had thought me weak, voiceless. But here in this room, their own lies were undoing them far more than I ever could. When it was over for the day, I rose with my notebook clutched to my chest. My children did not look at me as I passed. Their faces were twisted with anger, shame, and something darker, fear. Outside, the drizzle had stopped, and a pale shaft of sunlight broke through the clouds. I paused on the courthouse steps, breathing in the cool air. My heart was heavy still, but there was strength in it now. The storm had broken, and though the winds were fierce, I was still standing. And I knew the end was near. The courtroom was hushed on the second day, the kind of silence that hums with anticipation. My son and daughter sat stiffly, avoiding each other's eyes, their quarrel from the day before still hanging in the air like smoke. The judge glanced down at the papers before him, then lifted his gaze. "We have heard the arguments. We have examined the evidence," he said, his voice steady, authoritative. "But before I render any judgment, it is necessary to return to the will itself. The intentions of the deceased must guide our decision." My heart tightened. "Robert." The clerk rose and unfolded the pages once more. The words were familiar to me. I had heard them at the reading, tried to speak them myself before being silenced 15 times. But this time no one could cut me off. This time Robert would speak for himself. The clerk's voice carried across the room. "The estate divided, the company preserved, each child provided for under clear conditions. My children shifted uneasily as those conditions were laid bare again, their greed made obvious in contrast." And then the clerk reached the final page. He squinted slightly, leaning closer to the bottom of the text. "There is an additional clause," he said, "in smaller print." The judge motioned for him to continue. The clerk read slowly, each word deliberate. "If the son and daughter do not comply with all the points of the will, then everything, estate, company, and assets, shall pass into the ownership of my wife." The words hung in the air like a bell tolling in a church tower. A gasp rippled through the room. I felt it in my chest like a sudden rush of air, as though Robert himself had just stepped into the courtroom, steady and strong, placing his hand on my shoulder the way he used to when I needed courage. My daughter was the first to react. She shot to her feet, her face flushed crimson. "This is ridiculous. He couldn't have meant that." The judge raised a hand. "Sit down, Mrs. Miller." She faltered, then sank back into her chair, trembling. My son leaned forward, his voice hoarse. "This clause, this fine print, how can we know it's valid?" Mr. Harris rose calmly, his papers in order. "It is valid because your father signed it, because he meant it, and because your mother has kept every record, every letter, every instruction he left. He made provisions for precisely this situation, for what would happen if you tried to defy him." The judge nodded. "Indeed, the clause is binding." I felt tears prick my eyes, but they were not the hot tears of grief. They were steady, almost triumphant. Robert had seen further than I had. He had known what our children might do, and he had left me this shield, hidden in plain sight. My daughter buried her face in her hands. My son's shoulders slumped as though the weight of every debt, every lie, had finally broken him. For once they had no words. I closed my eyes for a moment, listening to the silence that followed. It wasn't the heavy silence of the funeral, or the stifling silence of being silenced at the will reading. It was a different kind of silence, final, absolute, the kind that follows truth. When I opened my eyes, I looked toward the judge, who was already speaking. "In light of this clause and in recognition of the children's clear disregard for the conditions of the will, all property, the family estate, and the company are to remain in the ownership of Mrs. Whittaker." The gavel struck, sharp and echoing. I did not move at first. My hands rested lightly on my handbag, my notebook safe within, but I no longer needed it. Robert's final word had been enough. As the courtroom emptied, I remained seated for a moment, letting it all sink in. Around me voices murmured, surprised, curious, perhaps even admiring. But I heard only Robert. His voice, deep and steady, whispering through the years. "I will protect you, even when I'm gone." Finally I rose, my steps slow but steady. My son and daughter stood near the door, their faces pale, their eyes avoiding mine. For a fleeting moment I almost reached for them, almost softened. But then I remembered their betrayal, their greed, their willingness to destroy everything for quick money. I walked past them without a word. Outside, the sun had broken through the clouds, spilling light across the courthouse steps. I lifted my face to it, breathing deeply. The warmth touched me like Robert's hand might have, firm and reassuring. He had given me one last gift, one last shield. His final word had not only saved our legacy, but reminded me that I was never truly alone. And as I walked down those steps, I felt lighter than I had in months. The fight was over. The estate was mine again. The company, too. Not through force or trickery, but through truth, and through Robert's careful hand, guiding me even from beyond the grave. My children, once so eager to claim everything, were left with nothing. Not money, not legacy, not even the dignity they had tried to strip from me. I returned home that evening and walked straight into the garden. The late roses were still blooming, their fragrance sweet in the cool air. Robert had planted them with his own hands, saying once, "These will outlast us both." And he was right. The flowers swayed gently in the breeze, as if in celebration. I knelt, touched the soil, and let myself breathe. The house behind me no longer felt empty. It felt safe, restored, mine to keep. For the first time since the funeral, I felt peace settle in my chest, soft and steady. My children had underestimated me. They had mistaken grief for weakness, silence for surrender. But silence had been my shield, patience my weapon, and love my strength. In the end, I had not fought with anger or bitterness, but with truth, and truth had carried me through. As the sun dipped low, I whispered into the garden air, "We did it, Robert. They couldn't undo us." And I felt him there, not in body but in spirit, strong, steady, walking beside me as he always had. I rose, brushed the soil from my hands, and smiled. My days ahead would be quieter, yes, but they would be mine. And I would live them not in sorrow but in triumph.